All right, good. Well, welcome everyone. This is our last Upstate Entrepreneur Ecosystem workshop for the springtime. We will not have another one again until September, and I will talk at the end of our workshop today about what to expect for the fall. But we are really glad once again to have Michael Nail talking to us about COVID rules for employers. As you know, things just continue to change for employers. And now that we have vaccines, there's a whole new set of rules. So Michael is going to talk about that today. And Justine, next slide, please. Oh, sorry. If y'all don't mind, please put your name in the chat and your organization. And if you have any questions for Michael, please put them in chat. But also feel free, since it's a small group here today, but feel free to just raise your hand or something so that we can just ask Michael directly. And then we get together. Justine, next slide, please. So the reason we get together at the Upstate Entrepreneur Ecosystem is to increase the total ecosystem's ability and capacity to help our entrepreneurs be more successful. And one of the ways that we do that is increase our knowledge about changes in rules and guidelines and laws. And this is one of those workshops where we will be learning again how things have changed. We also have workshops. Well, we also have another program that will be next week, which is just simply networking, so that we can reconnect with our peers in the ecosystem, celebrate, and just learn what everybody's been up to for the past year. So I'll have more information about that again at the end. But I am happy to turn it over to Michael right now. And so all yours, Michael. And thanks y'all for coming.
Awesome. Well, great to be back with everybody. It seems like it's been a while since I've actually presented on something substantive. I have attended a few meetings this year, but I think this might be my second substantive topic. But in 2020, it seems like we talked all year about COVID considerations, pretty much. As Aaron said, beginning in March, we hit the ground running, talking about the PPP issues to the best I could, even though I'm not really an expert on that. And then we talked about the unemployment issues, all the different things that were passed, all the different laws that were passed in the Trump administration. And now we are really focusing on the vaccinations. That's obviously the big topic nowadays and how that's affecting the workplace. And if you haven't heard me speak before, I do work for Ogletree Deakins. I'm an attorney there, and we specialize in employment law. So this is something that we've been tracking very closely, beginning in November, December timeframe, and hopefully I can provide you with some good information today. But again, we're going to be focusing on vaccinations. And if you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Or because we are such a small group today, which is perfectly fine, and that's great. Feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself and speak up. I don't anticipate it will take longer than 15 to 20 minutes, so we'll have plenty of time for questions. But if you have any as we go on, feel free to interrupt me. I'd be happy to address those. But move to the next slide for me, Justine. So I know we were going to talk about vaccinations, right? And that's what we're going to get to. But I did want to give you some brief information on a new law that was passed in South Carolina just last week. At the beginning of the pandemic, when all this started, one of the main fears that employers and businesses had was, am I going to be liable if someone comes into my store, they walk into my business, or one of my employees gets COVID-19, can they sue me for negligence, sue my business for negligence because they allege that they've contracted the disease in that place of work? A lot of those fears really haven't materialized. We haven't seen too many COVID-19 contraction claims, and when we do, those are usually brought under the workers' compensation system. But nevertheless, many states, the majority of states, I should say, have implemented what are called liability shield laws. which in essence say if you comply with all these CDC guidelines, applicable state guidelines as it relates to cleanliness and preventing the spread of COVID-19 in your place of work, in your business, then you will be shielded from these types of lawsuits from employees and from customers potentially. And South Carolina introduced a bill last year. It's been about a year ago they did, and they actually introduced 2 of them that failed. And finally, one made its way through the legislature, albeit a rocky road, and was eventually passed last week, signed by Governor McMaster. So we do have a liability shield in place. So even though we're really not seeing a lot of the claims that we thought we'd see, this is still a very positive development for businesses of all sizes in the state. The act goes into effect immediately. So if someone contracts COVID-19 at a business, at a place of work, it's going to be very, very difficult for that individual to be able to sue that business, that employer, for damages related to the disease. It has, go ahead.
Well, no, go ahead. Finish your sentence and then I'll ask my question, Michael. Sorry.
Oh, so yeah, there was a lot of different drafting under the bill, and the way that it ended up was very favorable to employers. So unless the individual can prove by clear and convincing evidence, which is a very high standard, that the employer did not reasonably adhere to the applicable guidance, then that claim will be barred. So that's going to be a very, very difficult thing to prove. And again, we don't think we'll see many of these claims anyway, but now if we do, businesses will have a very, very, very good defense as it relates to those claims. What was your question here?
I was just going to ask if it's retroactive.
Yes, it is. I have it pulled up right here. I don't want to misstate something, but it is retroactive to March 13th of 2020.
Okay, that's very favorable for businesses.
Very, 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 very positive development for businesses, and the provisions extend until the state of emergency is lifted. So 180 days after the final state of emergency is lifted. So whenever that may be, 180 days after that date. So very, very positive. And particularly with so many people getting vaccinations, hopefully that would never come up, but if it does, it would be a great defense. On that point, how about our first poll, Justine, about vaccinations? Have you received the vaccination?
I think we made the first one. The employer.
We can go ahead and do the first one then. So this will lead us into our topic. Does your employer mandate that you get the vaccine?
Sorry, Michael, I guess I put them together, so they're both probably going to pop up.
Okay, that's fine.
All anonymous. Of course.
Do we have any results?
We do. I'm waiting. I know someone who's halfway there, but I don't see anyone in that, so I was just waiting. All right, here's the results.
Okay. That's what I expected on number one, 100%. I expected that. Has your employer mandated vaccinations? You'll see why I asked that in a moment. And the second one was simply out of curiosity. I would assume that most individuals, I know that most people that I know have either gotten it or intend to get it. So I think that's a positive sign as well. You can go ahead and close that out and move to the next slide for me if you don't mind. And let me preface the presentation with this. A lot of these slides have a lot of wording in it. So I would encourage you to listen more to me than try to read the slides. The purpose of doing that was so that you can go back and look at it in more detail. And particularly for the people that weren't able to make it today, if they go back and watch the recording, they'll have a little bit more detail on these slides. But we're going to talk more big picture. So I would encourage you to listen to me more than trying to read those slides. It might get a little bit confusing, but move to the next slide for me. And always, I have to tell you a little bit about what my firm has done on this front. We've been staying on top of these issues from the beginning, and there are resources for businesses of all sizes. If you're interested in that, we have sample vaccine policies. That's one of the reasons why I asked about whether your place of business mandated the vaccine. That is permissible, as we will talk about. So there's different policies on whether it's mandatory or whether it's strongly encouraged, for example, and a lot of different information on multiple states if you do have businesses that operate outside of South Carolina as well. Move to the next slide for me. So the big issue, as I talked about before, was whether or not there was going to be any legal issues with mandating a vaccine. In December, we did get guidance. We received guidance from the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, that says that it was okay to mandate the vaccination under certain circumstances. There were also other considerations that came into play when you are thinking about vaccines. One of those is an ADA consideration, whether it's considered a medical examination, whether the vaccination or asking about the vaccination is a medical examination that requires certain steps to be taken in order to be done under legal compliance. And another one is whether it implicated GINA, the Genetic Information Act, and there's going to be issues with that as well. But there is a lot of leniency with vaccinations, because I think that most everyone wants to encourage the vaccinations in order to create herd immunity and such. So there's a lot of leeway that's been given under these particular laws as it relates to vaccines. And it's okay to ask employees to show proof of the vaccination. That's not a prohibited disability-related inquiry under the ADA. So these are some initial considerations to think about. Justine, can you move on for me? All right. So like I said, the mandatory vaccination is permissible, but there's certain situations that you have to take into consideration. For example, whether someone has a disability and needs an accommodation that we're going to talk about, whether they have a sincerely held religious belief. Those would be two exceptions that would need to be made if someone is mandating, or if a business is mandating, a vaccine. Now, if the vaccine is voluntary, as all of your employers have done, or all your businesses have done, which my employer has done as well, then that issue will not come up. It's only coming up in a mandatory vaccination context. And one of the reasons why many businesses are not mandating the vaccine is because you're going to have to live with the consequences too. So if one of those exceptions doesn't apply, if there's not a disability related issue or a sincerely held religious belief, you need to be prepared to part ways with that employee potentially and apply that mandatory policy on a neutral and consistent basis. So that's one reason why there's many employers, I'd say the vast majority of employers, that do not mandate vaccines. We're only seeing that primarily in the healthcare context. And that's because there's more of a direct interaction with other individuals. In situations like that, employers are more inclined to mandate the vaccine. Can you move on for me, Justine? All right, so as we said, the EEOC guidance talks about the ADA and what questions can be asked to an employee. Most of the questions have to comply with the ADA standard, which means they have to be job related, consistent with business necessity. Now, you can ask an employee whether they've been vaccinated, but there's a difference between getting into the nitty gritty details about that. And particularly if they haven't been vaccinated, why haven't they been vaccinated? So in order to ask those types of questions, it has to be job related, consistent with business necessity, which is the ADA catchphrase. Move on the next slide for me. All right. Did we move on to the next slide? Okay. Keep going on, please. I'm sorry. All right. So as I said, with a mandatory vaccination, which it doesn't seem like is very applicable, so I'm not going to keep talking about it too much, but you have to be willing to discharge those employees who refuse to vaccinate. Otherwise, why do you have the mandatory policy, right? So that's one thing that's really prevented a lot of businesses from taking that step, even though they want their employees to be vaccinated so that they're able to work and obviously stay healthy. They're not willing to part ways with individuals that simply don't want to get it for one reason or another. That might not be a disability related reason or a sincerely held religious belief reason. South Carolina does have a bill too that would prevent adverse employment actions, so prevent terminations against employees who refuse to vaccinate. So that's another consideration as well. It hasn't made too much movement through the legislature, but there is a bill pending on that topic. Now, if you're a business that wants strongly to have employers be vaccinated, which I assume most businesses would, then one thing we're seeing is incentives that are given to employees. So we're not mandating a vaccine, but we're saying, hey, we want you to get it, we encourage you to get it, and here's something that you will get in return. We'll give you a gift card, we'll give you more PTO. You can get creative with these types of gifts as long as they're not connected in some way to your company benefit plan. That could create a whole set of issues under the ERISA that I know nothing about, but I wanted to make a plug about that, that it cannot be connected in any way to that company benefit plan. But there are incentives that can be given that would put somebody over the top, so to speak, that's on the fence of getting the vaccine, that would enable them to get it. Can you move to the next slide for me? All right, so I know we've been jumping around and we talked about these mandatory policies. We know that they are illegal. I've said that they are permissible unless there is a covered disability. There's a reason that someone cannot get it because of a disability or a sincerely held religious beliefs. We know that most employers encourage the vaccines with incentives. We've talked about that. And if there is a mandatory policy, then you'd have to go through the steps of accommodating that individual under the ADA or under the applicable laws related to those sincerely held religious beliefs. Move to the next slide for me. And here's just a slide here that says personal or ethical objections to vaccines do not require an accommodation. So again, the key phrase is sincerely held religious belief. A purely personal objection to the vaccine, if you have a mandatory one, mandatory policy, would not suffice. You'd have to be willing to part ways with that employee. Move to the next slide for me. And all of this is going to be a very fact-intensive process, particularly under the ADA, if you do have a mandatory policy or if that is in place in the future. you'd have to go through that fact-intensive process of figuring out what the disability is, if there is some sort of accommodation that can be made for that particular individual. Speaking of accommodations, let's move to the next slide. So you have to determine whether that accommodation is reasonable. And again, that's a very fact-intensive analysis. It depends on the job. It's a case-by-case analysis. For example, a face covering here instead of a vaccination might be reasonable for somebody working in a cubicle. They're not really around as many people, but it wouldn't be reasonable for a frontline healthcare worker, for example, or a barber, hairdresser, someone who's constantly in contact with someone else. So this isn't likely to apply to your business, but it's just a common example of what we're seeing as the difference between a reasonable and what is not a reasonable accommodation. Some more examples are on the next slide here. So vaccines without certain ingredients, objectionable material. We talked about face covering, physical distancing. Reassignment is another example of an accommodation. Leaves of absence, remote work, which we know now is very feasible for most employees. But we don't want to use termination as an accommodation. That should be the last step if we're trying to accommodate somebody. That's the last resort that we can go to under these applicable laws, including the ADA. Move to the next slide for me. All right, side effects. So I know that before we got on, I was talking to Justine and Aaron about my experience with the vaccine. I got the Moderna, and I know the first dose, my shoulder was extremely sore. I consider myself in good shape. I like to work out, lift weights and things like that, but I could barely lift my arm. So I was not used to that, my arm being debilitated like that, but that lasted for a couple of days. And the second shot that I got 6 weeks later, I was basically bedridden for a whole day. So I'm very aware of the side effects that can occur with the vaccines. Now, some considerations here. Will you allow pay time off for these side effects? We're seeing employers do that. Workers' comp could result for vaccination side effects, and this will probably only come up if it's a more long-term side effect, not a day or two. I don't think that employee would find it beneficial to file workers' comp unless they had to go to the doctor or were sent to the hospital for some reason. But there is a chance that a side effect could be covered under workers' comp. And that depends on whether the vaccination is mandatory versus encouraged, whether that vaccination occurred on site, or whether it was done by a third party. I will say that in most scenarios, it will be covered under workers' comp. It's going to be a fact-intensive analysis, but in most cases, if you can connect some benefit to the employer to that vaccination, so if you've encouraged it in any way, then it's likely going to be covered under workers' comp. And also, if the employer pays for it, that's another consideration to keep in mind as well. When we're talking about the vaccine, you want to be careful with internal messaging in education. And I know that with these entrepreneur support providers, these entrepreneurs are smaller businesses. So a lot of this and a lot of these next couple slides they're geared more towards large employers that have teams of people to implement these policies, make sure they're applied consistently, and make sure that the messaging is positive and appropriate to the workforce, because COVID-19 is still it can be a very scary topic even now. So we want to talk about, and we want to make sure we're implementing consistent policies that are written based on these continuing developing guidelines that are becoming second nature at this point, and doing everything right as it relates to vaccines. Can you move to the next slide for me? So we've talked about this. We've talked about these considerations that are on these slides: ensuring confidentiality, processing accommodation requests, implementing protective measures. We talked about incentives to vaccinate. And these are all things that can be put in a policy and communicated to these employees to make sure everything is clear, everything is transparent, as we have been doing from the beginning of the pandemic. Can you move to the next slide for me? And again, as I talked about, develop positive employee communications. The internal messaging is very important. We don't want there to be any gray area as it relates to these issues, and make sure we're still providing timely information and updates. The CDC guidance, the DHEC guidance, has become a lot more stagnant as opposed to March, April, May 2020. But as things change, particularly with the vaccinations and the more data that we have, the science behind the impact of the vaccinations, for example, whether someone can still transmit it, and what we do with vaccinated employees, do they still have to wear masks and things of that nature. Those are all things to continue to stay up to date with, so that we're complying with all applicable laws and doing all that we can to protect our employees. Move to the next slide for me. So on that note, again, a lot of these are more geared towards large employers, but the same principles apply. We want to make sure that our supervisors, whoever is really the face of the company interacting with these employees, to be able to address the employees' questions concerning COVID-19, make sure everything is organized properly in a central location. And however it's best to communicate these issues for your specific company, it's different for everybody, is the way to go. Move to the next slide. So again, in order to plan for success, we talked about this. We want to make sure that we are planning ahead of time, making sure that we are communicating appropriately, reviewing the CDC guidance, the DHEC guidance. I know that they're still developing information related to the vaccine. I checked it today, and they still don't know the full impact of being vaccinated. That will change as we receive more data and more science. So making sure that we stay up to date with all these things, and be prepared for controversy. There's going to be issues that arise. Like I said, there could be side effects. There's employees that aren't getting the vaccine. There's employees that are. How do you treat both of them? How do they mesh? And that is something to consider as well, and make sure we're doing that on a consistent and compliant basis. We move to the next slide. So again, to wrap it up, how to handle vaccinated employees. Really, the guidance has stayed the same. Until we know more, until the CDC knows more, they are still recommending that everybody wear face coverings. I'm sure that you heard about the gatherings for vaccinated employees where there's lessened restrictions there. But if we are in the workplace, if we're coming in, the recommendation is still in the public common areas to wear face coverings, still be socially distanced, just to make sure before we know more that everybody is staying safe. So that is, in a nutshell, vaccination, some of the legal considerations associated with that. We also talked about the liability shield, which is a very positive development for employers of all sizes. And so with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that you have. And if not, we can go our separate ways. Are there any questions?
If anyone has a question? Oh yeah, Costas, go ahead. I was gonna say, unmute yourself and go ahead and ask.
So they recommend even after getting the vaccination, you should still wear face coverings and stuff. So if a business is allowing its employees to not wear a mask that's interacting with customers, could that open them up to potential liability if someone did want to file a lawsuit. I understand chances of that happening are pretty slim, but could it create an opportunity there?
Definitely. Yeah. There'd be potential liability because at that point, and like I said, it's a very difficult hurdle for that particular person to prove that they contracted it at this particular place of business. But that would be considered, in my opinion, there'd be an argument that they aren't reasonably adhering to applicable guidance. So that, even though that's a low standard, if that's what the CDC is recommending, they're not doing it, then yes, it could potentially open up to liability.
Okay.
I think until we know more, it's to be on the complete safe side, continue to do what we've always done for this last year. That's basically, that's going to be our recommendation to employers, to businesses, even though we want to, and I want to, now that I'm vaccinated, particularly say, okay, everything's back to normal. I don't think we can rush into that just yet, because we want to make sure that we have the complete green light in order to do so legally.
Michael,
Personally, it's fine, but from a legal standpoint, when it relates to businesses, I think we have to play it safe.
Hey, Michael, I know this isn't your area per se, but I'm wondering if you would view that it's a businesses can require vaccinations as a precursor to schools adding COVID vaccination as part of their required vaccinations.
Yeah, it's not in my realm, but just from what I hear and what I see, and again, I don't have any data to support this, but I think we could be going in that direction.
I was just thinking about, it just hit me as you were talking that, your child can't go in public school. I'm not sure about private schools, but you have to supply particular vaccinations before they can go to school on the first day. So, and in subsequent years as well. Okay, thanks. I know that's not your area.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, and I've wondered the same. And I assume that you've heard something that prompted you to ask that too. But yeah, it wouldn't surprise me.
Michael, I apologize. I was detained and missed most of your presentation, so I'm sure you answered these questions, but I have two questions. One of them is, are companies requiring employees to have the vaccine? Is that something they can do? And then the second question is, as it relates to work in the office as opposed to working at home, what if you have employees who, they're in an industry where they can work anywhere and they prefer to work at home as opposed to working in the office? As a company, can you require them to come in, or how does that work? Those are two very separate questions, but and like I said, you probably answered them earlier. I apologize, but could you touch on those?
Sure. The answer to the first one is yes, you can mandate the vaccine as an employer. Do employers mandate the vaccine? Likely not. I know in our poll, there are, I think, 7 or 8 people on this call. No one's business mandates the vaccine. We're not seeing that unless it's in the healthcare field. That would be the only situation we've really seen it. But it is permissible as long as you are accommodating individuals that are disabled and can't take the vaccine because of a disability related reason or because of a sincerely held religious belief. And another reason why we talked about many employers are not mandating the vaccine is because you have to be willing to part ways with your workforce that won't get it. If you're mandating it, they won't get it. They don't have a disability. and they don't have a sincerely held religious belief, then you have to terminate them if it's mandatory. So that's, I mean, businesses aren't willing to do that.
I had an employer ask me, I think yesterday or day before, about that, and I think they were related more to new hires too. If they could, if people were mandating for new hires, kind of to your point about, losing people you already have. But would that get you, if you did that, would that get you into kind of a hot water? Because, well, you're making, some people, mandate that they have it, whereas if you grandfather in other employees, they're not. I mean, could that create a separate problem for a company?
That is an interesting question, and it's not really one that I've seen play out. But I would think that it would be a problem if I think what you're saying is if you're not mandating it for the current workforce, but you do for prospective.
Right.
Yeah, I think that would be problematic.
Okay. Good. And then the second question was related to working from home. What's the requirement there?
Right. I think it's a pretty similar analysis. Now, I think most employers would say if someone has been working remote and they have been productive, then they are able to stay at home. There's no reason to force them back. I mean, you can have a policy that says you have to work from the office, but I don't think that would be necessary. And you're also going to have to consider whether there's particularly if that person has a disability or something and they have to be accommodated. Disabilities are very common nowadays. So there's we say that the ADA stands for assumed disabled always. So someone can always, muster up a disability if they want to. I hate to say that, but I'm probably considered disabled under the definition of it under the ADA. So those are considerations you're going to have to think about, but a lot of it's more practical, whether that individual is productive or not. I mean, I think that most companies would prefer that people be in person. I particularly like to be in person, but there's no reason to require that if they are productive and they have been over the last year at home.
Great, thanks.
Michael, I had one question that I put into chat so I wouldn't forget it. And that is that if someone does not get the vaccination, doesn't get vaccinated, and they get COVID, is the company still required to follow the emergency medical family leave requirements, that they have to be paid a certain percentage and they have to be allowed off 2 weeks work, or how does that work now?
To be honest with you, Aaron, I don't know. I have not looked into the issue. I'm not going to try to make up the answer. So I can find out for you, but I did not look into that.
Okay, well, that's fine. Because I was, because will that go away if it's emergency medical family leave? But you haven't looked at that, so okay.
Yeah, I honestly haven't. I haven't looked at that in about a year. So.
Okay. All right. So there also seemed to be a contradiction in one of the rules. So if you mandate vaccinations, but then it seemed that there was a law that said that you couldn't use employment, you couldn't do anything to harm someone's employment. Then, so if someone isn't vaccinated and they have no need for accommodations and they have to be terminated. And I don't remember exactly which slide that was on.
Yeah, so South Carolina has a bill that says you can't take adverse employment action against someone who refuses to vaccinate. So I don't think it will come up and that's really what it is. It has no more detail than that. So we really don't know what it means.
Mhm.
It's just out there.
Okay.
But I think whoever it was that introduced that bill just said, wait a minute, let's just make sure that employers can't terminate somebody because they don't get vaccinated. There's really not any more detail. It hasn't made its way through at all, really, the legislator. So I don't think it's going to get passed, but I just put it in there to make you aware.
Okay. Good. All right. Thank you. So I have a question for those of you who work with entrepreneurs, and that would be, I know definitely Elise and Costas and Katie and Raj. Do your business owners, what kind of concerns are they expressing about this next stage with COVID?
That's a
Or are
good
they
question.
expressing
I'd be interested to hear that too, because I think the concerns have shifted certainly from last year.
Unfortunately, for most of them, it's status quo when it comes to HR. That's on the back burner. They don't really think about it. They don't worry about it until an issue arises, unfortunately, because that's one of those areas where HR law, they don't understand the complexities of it, of managing HR, and many don't take on a HR consultant or firm to help with that. And so they're just kind of taking their chances, and they're not really worried about that. Their main focus is just getting through with enough revenue so that the business survives. And it's understandable, you got to be concerned about having the revenue to survive, but it just scares me when it comes to HR, the lack of knowledge, the playing of Russian roulette that a lot of these businesses do, the chances that they take, because they can just, so many, I think, open themselves up to so much liability, and they don't even realize it.
Yeah, and that's one of the things, honestly, that I've been preaching from the beginning. When I started speaking to this group, I said, I know that these small businesses don't want to think about that, but it's honestly more cost effective to stay on top of it on the front end, in my opinion, than have something happen where you're spending a lot more money trying to fix that problem or defend that lawsuit potentially. So it's not a plug for Ogletree, but I think y'all should definitely encourage people to think about that more on the front end and get on top of those issues and develop the policies at the beginning, as opposed to waiting until something happens. It's a lot harder to play catch up.
And that was part of the reason why I asked that question at the beginning, earlier on, about the employees not wearing masks, if they could be opening themselves up to liability. And I've actually seen that in a number of cases where the customers have masks on, but the employees don't. And I just kind of cringe a little bit, just like, oh man, that's just, it's a risk. I mean, and from the standpoint, chances of them getting sued, I would think it's going to be very difficult, because how do you prove it? But
Yeah.
at the same time, it's still taking that risk. And the other thing is, I mean, if you got enough customers that they get offended by seeing someone who works there not wearing a mask, guess what? That's one customer you just lost.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's more. That's why I said I think you play it safe, because look, the chances are slim to none that they even get COVID, and much less have to prove that they got it there. But I think that if it did happen, you could have just worn a mask. It doesn't take much effort to do that, but then you're preventing those issues from happening.
I think for successful litigation, you'd almost have to have a perfect storm of someone who didn't wear a mask and then they tested positive right after that. And then the timing of maybe someone had a receipt to show that they were in there, stuff like that. But
So does that
I agree.
legal shield, the liability shield, does that apply in this kind of circumstance too?
Mhm.
Okay,
It
All right.
would. But I think if the CDC is saying if you're vaccinated to still wear a mask
right, okay,
and you're not doing that, then I think that makes it a lot easier for somebody to prove if they did contract it that, you know, they weren't complying with the standards. So that shows that I contracted it there.
okay, good.
Michael, what does EPLI insurance cover?
It would, I think it would cover that. Should.
I mean, is that what you're recommending for small businesses or medium? I mean, for small businesses?
It wouldn't, I mean, it wouldn't hurt in my opinion. I don't know, honestly, don't know what the rates and all that are, but I don't think it would hurt. Particularly as the business grows. I mean, once you get to, you know, about 10 to 15 employees, different types of laws start to apply. And as the company grows, I think that is a thing, a positive thing to have as EPLI. What are you seeing businesses do in that regard?
Well, I agree with you. I think it would be, wouldn't be the right approach if you're hiring people to not have EPLI. And not only that, but I mean, my approach or philosophy to business is a little different. I think that we're seeing that shift occurring more and more now to where it's individuals and families that are the most important, and the business comes from that, and then et cetera, community, et cetera, schools, et cetera. Just out of necessity to, at least for the companies that are shifting that way for engagement and retention.
Raj, very quickly, EPL, for people who don't know, EPLI.
Employer protection liability insurance.
Okay. All right, very good. Good, thank you. Elise, having just finished your class, your Start Me class, did you hear anything about from your owners, their concerns?
You know, most of ours haven't expressed a lot of concern. The majority of our businesses don't have physical locations. Those that do are interacting with customers like frequently. We have a couple who do like hair braiding or other like cosmetic types of procedures. I think as far as I know, they just plan to continue with mask precautions. And most of our businesses, at least at this point, they don't really have a lot of employees. Most of the people that are working with them are, you know, daughters or spouses or, you know, mom or dad or, you know, aunts and uncles and that kind of thing. And so they haven't expressed the same amount of concern as I expect that they would as, you know, as they grow. I will say I was surprised that you said that employers would be able to mandate it because I had actually read an opinion from a legal firm, not in South Carolina, but somewhere else, that had said because the vaccines are only authorized as emergency use currently, it wouldn't be able to be mandated until they were approved outside, whatever it is outside of emergency use. So I was interested to hear that.
All right, very good. Well, we have 6 minutes left. Any final questions? So, well, Michael, thank you very much. Justine, if you'll put the slides back up, I will go over some of the new things and also just want to extend an additional thank you to Michael and his firm because they are one of our sponsors for this workshop series. And they have been sponsoring us when nobody else, not that we weren't worthy, but they were one of our very first sponsors, and Michael has been working with our ESOs for quite a while. So thank you, Michael. We truly appreciate it. But upcoming, we do have a couple of things. On May 11th, we're having a kind of a networking event for the Upstate entrepreneur ecosystem. So anyone who works with or supports entrepreneurs, we're going to get together by Zoom and connect and celebrate this year of an immense amount of learning and work on our part to try to keep the businesses up and running and hopefully thrive, at least surviving. We are having Phil Yanoff, who runs a networking event in 4 different cities and learned how to do this on Zoom exceptionally well. He will be facilitating that meeting. He will also use that time to teach us how to better facilitate meetings so that the attendees, either in person or by Zoom, feel comfortable, and so that they can open up and be more likely to connect in a productive way. But throughout the summer, we will be launching our Start Grow Resource Navigator, and we will have trainings and workshops and seminars on how to use that. And then on August 24th, we will get together again to celebrate the end of summer and the beginning of the next year with the total UEE to network and talk about Global Entrepreneurship Week as we prepare for that for this November. And then on September 14th, that will be our first deep dive workshop again, and we are going to be featuring the platform at Greer. We'll be talking about why they launched it, what kind of programming they provide, and then the impact it is having in their community on their entrepreneurs. And then of course we have some other in the fall, but this all fit on one slide. So that is our next few meetings. So hopefully you can join us on the 11th. It will be a very quick hour. We'll be in and out of Zoom rooms, talking, introducing ourselves, talking about where we were most successful, and it's just in general celebrating. And I will also give you a sneak peek of our Resource Navigator website at that meeting, so you can start looking at it. All right, Justine, I think that's it. Anything else? Are there any other slides? No, okay. Well, thanks to everybody for coming today. I appreciate it. And we'll see you next week.
Everyone.
All right, thanks. Take care.